to the problems plaguing The Voice. When Albanese announced his chosen model just a few days ago, he was cheered by Labor staffers lining the halls in Parliament House. He was emotional.
So to not put this to a vote is to concede defeat.
But the celebrations, the tears were premature. Because right now, Albanese's model is more likely to face defeat than a landslide win at a referendum. If The Voice and Indigenous recognition in the Constitution are so deeply important to the Prime Minister, then surely he needs to do everything in his power to find a model that all Australians can agree on, a model with bipartisan support. But there seems to be no attempt to find a model that the coalition would stand side by side with Labor and campaign on. Attorney General Mark Dreyfus has dismissed Peter Dutton's calls for the release of the Solicitor General's advice about The Voice.
And I'd say again, we've gone through a very comprehensive and rigorous process. The overwhelming consensus from Australia's top constitutional lawyers is that this provision is constitutionally sound.
Legitimate questions about how The Voice would operate and which issues it would actually apply to are also being dismissed. The Prime Minister strongly rejected any suggestion yesterday that The Voice would provide advice on legislation like the Safeguard Mechanism.
Is this something you can imagine a Voice providing advice on, and would a Voice provide advice to the Greens as they would the government, or is it purely for legislation like this? How would that work?
Of all the very strange questions I've been asked about The Voice, that's up there. The Voice is about matters that directly affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That's what it's about. And people shouldn't look for, on The Voice, distractions.
After his answer, it did seem like a ridiculous point to think The Voice could advise on the Safeguard Mechanism, Labor's climate change policy, but not according to some Indigenous leaders. Greens, First Nations and Resources spokeswoman Dorinda Cox says Albanese's comments are deeply disappointing. She told The Australian, "Let me be very clear, as someone who has visited on country with traditional owners in the Tiwi, on Murray-Darug, in the Pillager Forest, I can say without doubt coal and gas projects are affecting First Nations people." She said mob out there actively campaigning against Barossa, Beetaloo, Narrabri and Scarborough because their entire way of life is affected. These projects affect their ability to hold ceremony on country. They destroy sacred sites, contaminate the waters and land, interrupt First Nations access to traditional food sources and sever spiritual connections and intangible cultural heritage that has existed for over 65,000 years. The point here is there is no clarity on what exactly The Voice would give advice on. Albanese ruled out climate change, but Indigenous leaders, as you've just heard, say that should be in the scope of The Voice. It's clearly complicated and it's not a simple matter of deciding where the line would be drawn. Now, former Prime Ministers Tony Abbott and John Howard have both said they can't support the model that Albanese has put forward.
But this is so much more than recognition. This is the biggest change to our Constitution that we've ever been asked to make, and this would be a massive change to the way our country is governed.
When you are talking about a body that can make recommendations to every part of the federal government and the potential for those recommendations being litigated if they're rejected, I think you've gone into a new constitutional quagmire.
Even Labor veteran Graham Richardson doesn't support the model Albanese, his very good friend, is proposing.
I'll tell you one federal issue, Karen, that I think, if it's going to help us, is The Voice. I can tell you right now, punters, out there, they don't like it.
I'm not voting for it.
No, I'm not voting for it either.
He said, sorry, Richard,
I'm
not voting for it. For The Voice.
If Albanese doesn't want a hurtful and humiliating defeat at the referendum, he needs to sit down with the coalition, sit down with the fiercest Voice critics and find a model that's acceptable to all Australians and that both sides of politics can support. because a crushing defeat at a referendum would alienate and isolate Indigenous Australians, achieving the opposite outcome of what Albanese wants. But according to political correspondent for The Australian, Geoff Chambers, Albanese doesn't seem to be looking for bipartisan support, and this has now become purely political.
Well, I think it's increasingly political, because you've got to remember in July last year at the Garma Festival, Anthony Albanese released this amendment, and what we saw last week was very slight tweaks to those. So we went through this long process, and the constitutional reference group that was set up last met on February 2, and that was not reporting to the government, that was reporting to the working group, which then ultimately provided the final recommended wording and key design principles, which the government and cabinet rubber stamp. So I don't think there's much goodwill from the government's perspective to have a bipartisan approach on this referendum.